The movie begins with a tough guy prisoner named Mylock. He's in the prison yard, and he's beating up another inmate really bad until the other guy passes out. Mylock doesn't want to stop fighting, but the guards rush in and quickly grab him to calm him down. While all this is happening, there's this guy in one of the cells. His prisoner number is 451. He's just sitting there, reading a book. Despite appearing quiet, he is known as the most ruthless prisoner because he ruthlessly killed his cellmate in his sleep by pulling out several teeth using a pair of pliers. Switching to a factory in Russia, an American man named Kyle Leblanc who works there, he's chatting with his wife, Gray Leblanc, who's back home, and she suggests they take a vacation together. But Kyle's got a lot of work at the factory, so he turns down the idea. Later, as Kyle's heading home, he calls Gray, who's busy cooking dinner. While they're talking, Gray doesn't notice this stranger, Sergio Kovic, watching her. Suddenly, Sergio barges into the house and tries to hurt Gray. She puts up a fight, but Sergio pulls out a folding knife and kills her. Kyle, still on the phone, hears his wife screaming and rushes home, almost causing a crash on the road. When he gets home, he finds Gray unconscious and covered in blood. Sergio, who's hiding, tries to hit Kyle with a flower vase. Fortunately, Kyle dodges it and chases Sergio out of the house. They both end up on a public bus, and they start fighting. Sergio uses his folding knife again to attack Kyle. They struggle and tumble off the bus onto the street, but Sergio gets away, and the cops catch Kyle, who's hurt in the process. Because of all that, Kyle ended up taking the case to court, but he was disappointed with the judge's decision to release Sergio because Sergio came from a powerful family and had bribed the crooked judge in secret. Kyle was devastated by this decision, especially when Sergio seemed to mock him. That's when Kyle grabbed a cop's gun in the courtroom and shot Sergio dead. His actions landed him a life sentence with no chance of parole. They sent him to Kavi prison, which was notorious for being the toughest and meanest prison in Russia. When Kyle got to the prison, he and the other new guys had to meet the corrupt head jailer, General Khrushchev, who had no problem shooting prisoners trying to escape. Along with Kyle, there was this 21-year-old American guy named Billy. After the introduction, they had to hand over all their valuables, including Kyle's wedding ring. He put up a fight but got beaten by the guards until he gave it up. In the grooming room, they even cut Billy's long hair when they saw it. That night, all the new guys who didn't have cells had to bunk together in a room. Kyle noticed one of the guards was wearing his wedding ring, which got him pretty upset. But he couldn't help himself, and he managed to sneak in a photo of his wife. When everyone else went to sleep, Kyle suddenly woke up when he heard the guard's voice. The guard was taking Billy out of the room and selling him to a senior inmate named Andrei, who had a creepy reputation for going after younger guys. The next day, all the inmates were going to the bathroom, and Kyle, who was still new to prison life and feeling confused, went along with the others. He tried to ignore everything happening around him until he saw Andrei coming out of his cell, leaving Billy all beaten up. When Kyle saw Andrei's face, which reminded him of Sergio, the guy who taunted him before, he attacked Andrei, but that landed him in isolation room. He was so upset that he refused to eat the food the guards gave him and ended up starving for days. Kyle felt weak and started losing his mind, even thinking about do the unthinkable. When his attempt failed, he banged his head against the wall, making the neighboring isolation cell's occupants angry and pounding the wall as a sign for Kyle to be quiet. But then, a butterfly flew into Kyle's cell through a broken window. It made him think of Gray, because she once asked him not to harm such a delicate creature. The butterfly even landed on Kyle's food plate. Thinking of Gray, he finally found the will to go on and started eating his meal. After spending 5 days in isolation, they moved him to the same cell as 451. The prison guard told him that 451 had killed 3 of his previous cellmates, and that if Kyle wanted to switch cells, he'd have to pay some cash to the prison bosses. Kyle didn't make a fuss about it and just went into the cell. He purposely didn't say hi to 451 because he didn't want to bother the guy. The next day, Kyle's brother-in-law came to visit. He told Kyle that Gray had been buried where Kyle had wanted, and he asked Kyle to use some of the money he gave him to make his time in prison a bit more comfortable. In the days that followed, Kyle and the other inmates had to work outside the prison for free, and all the money they made went to the higher-ups at Kavi prison. Kyle wasn't used to hard labor, and he got really tired. The guards forced him to keep working. On another day, during a break in the prison routine, Kyle bumped into Billy, who thanked him for standing up to Andre. They soon became friends. They also met a guy named Malachi, who was in a wheelchair. Word was that Malachi could sneak all sorts of stuff into the prison, so a lot of inmates asked for his help. When Malachi learned that Kyle was in cell 451, he suggested Kyle move before something bad happened with 451 around. Malachi explained that the prison authorities allowed 451 to do bad stuff because they made money from inmates who paid to switch cells. That night, Kyle stared at Gray's photo again, but he had a nightmare and made a disturbance in the cell. 451, disturbed by it, covered Kyle's mouth and nose until he woke up. On another day, while Kyle was having a meal with Billy and Malachi, Andre showed up and messed with Kyle, hitting him and spitting on his food. Kyle tried to keep his cool and not make trouble. Later on, there was an event called Sparka, where inmates fought each other. The prison higher-ups bet on who'd win. Andre seemed unbeatable, and Billy, worried he'd become Andre's prize if he won, secretly made a weapon from a toothbrush handle. But Andre found out and beat Billy severely, even using the toothbrush handle against him. The very next day, while Kyle was working outside the prison, he found himself in trouble again. One of Andre's gang members pushed him and lied, saying that Kyle had disrespected them. The boss of the place asked Andre's gang to sort it out, and they ended up beating up Kyle. Strangely, it was Kyle who got put back in isolation because of what happened. When he went into isolation, he calmly tapped on the wall to signal to the guy in the cell next door. After a week, he became friends with the guy in the neighboring cell, even though they could only communicate through the wall taps. It turned out that the guy was Mylok, who had been put in isolation after a brutal fight during Sparka. When Kyle got out of isolation and headed back to his cell, he ran into Andre, who started teasing him. Kyle tried not to react and just went to his cell. While in there, he secretly read a book that belonged to 451, and even though 451 knew about it, he didn't do anything to Kyle. During lunchtime, Andre tried to bother Kyle again, and eventually Kyle lost his temper and went after him. But he ended up being taken back to isolation by force. Around the same time, while the inmates were working in the field, something unexpected happened. A prison guard's car hit a landmine, and it kept the guards busy. Billy and some other inmates saw this as a chance to escape, but they got caught and faced even worse treatment from the prison guards. Meanwhile, Kyle showed his determination by getting physically stronger. He joined Sparka and had to fight against Andre. At first, Kyle was getting beaten pretty bad, but he who could no longer think clearly attacked Andre by biting his neck until he died. Everyone who saw it was shocked because Kyle seemed like he had completely lost himself. The prison bosses then used him to keep fighting so they could make money from bets. Some other inmates felt sorry for Kyle, thinking he was just being used by the prison leaders, including 451 who had warned Kyle not to lose himself and be a pawn. On Russia's Independence Day, Billy saw his chance to escape because he was tired of being at the mercy of the prison guards. Malachi helped him by giving him the exit door key for free, even though he usually charged a lot for that kind of help. Before leaving, Billy said goodbye to Kyle. At the same time, a new guy named Valia was sent to Kavi prison on purpose to fight against Kyle in a Sparka match. That night, all the inmates gathered for dinner to celebrate Independence Day. Billy secretly tried to escape, but he didn't know that Malachi had told the guards and messed up his plan. 451 watched what Malachi was up to from a distance. Because of Malachi's actions, Billy's escape failed, and he became the prize for another Sparka fight, this time against Valia. After Valia won, he confronted Billy, who kept resisting. The next day, they found Billy in really bad shape. Valia had beaten him up the night before. When Kyle found Billy, who was on the verge of death, Billy managed to tell Kyle not to lose himself before he passed away. Sometime later, there was a match between Valia and Kyle, but Kyle refused to fight back. This made the prison bosses lose their bets, so they decided to punish Kyle by tying him up in the middle of the field. Meanwhile, 451 gave Malachi the kerosene he asked for. But then, unexpectedly, 451 poured the kerosene on Malachi. Malachi begged 451 not to kill him, but 451 ignored him and set him on fire for betraying Billy. When they looked at Kyle, who had been hanging in the field for days in all kinds of weather, it seemed like he earned the respect of the other inmates for bravely defying the prison leaders. Andrew's gang, who used to hate Kyle, seemed to make amends with him and refused to take part in Sparka fights. Khrushchev was pretty confused by the new situation in the prison, something he'd never dealt with before. So he decided to talk to all the inmates and said he'd make Kyle fight again, this time against Mylok. Kyle looked really overwhelmed facing Mylok, but when he realized who Mylok really was, he tapped on the wall to let Mylok know they were friends from Isolation. Everyone was shocked by this revelation, and one prison guard, who was worried because his plan failed, shot and killed Mylok on purpose. That caused total chaos in the prison, and all the inmates tried to break out by damaging the cell doors. While all this was going on, Kyle and 451 were chatting. 451 confessed that he didn't kill Kyle because Kyle didn't act all tough like the other inmates. He said he'd help Kyle escape from prison on one condition: that Kyle had to gather evidence of the crimes the prison leaders had committed and send it to the authorities. Inside the prison, the guards were trying to stop the riot by beating up the inmates who resisted. After things settled down, the next morning, all the inmates were gathered in the field, and some of them were knocked out. Meanwhile, 451 managed to break through the cell wall and showed Kyle the evidence of the prison leader's crimes. He told Kyle that he could escape from prison after fighting Valia, even if he won the fight. The plan was to make Kyle seem useless so the prison would execute him, but at that moment, he'd have a chance to flee with the evidence of Khrushchev and others' crimes. Sometime later, the fight between Kyle and Valia happened. They showed off their fighting skills in front of everyone until Kyle won by breaking Valia's arm. Valia, not willing to accept defeat, tried to cheat by attacking Kyle with a hidden knife in his shoe, but he ended up stabbing his own boss instead. Meanwhile, Kyle delivered the final blow as revenge for how Valia had treated Billy. As 451 had predicted, after the fight, they were about to execute Kyle. 2 guards took him to the parking lot for it, but just before they could carry out the punishment, 451 came. He fought and defeated the 2 guards. Kyle used his strength to beat one of the guards and cleverly dragged him under a car that was being jacked up, crushing the guard by releasing the jack. Soon after, 451 handed over all the evidence of Khrushchev and his gang's crimes, hoping Kyle would expose the corrupt system in Krvavy prison to the public. To make his escape easier, Kyle put on a prison guard uniform and drove away. The gatekeeper, thinking Kyle was one of the prison officials, didn't check and let him leave without any trouble. Meanwhile, 451 went to Khrushchev's office, scaring the general. Enraged by Khrushchev's unfair treatment of the inmates, 451 attacked the prison leader with a pair of pliers and pulled out his teeth. Shortly after, the guards found Khrushchev lifeless, and 451 sat calmly on the sofa. In the end, the film showed Kyle, who had tasted freedom and intended to give all the evidence of the wrongdoing at Krvavy prison to the authorities. 3 months after the evidence was handed over, the prison was finally officially closed. Moral lesson from the story is, when you're in a tough spot, remember, it's not about fighting your way out of it, but it's about taking on more than you can handle.